This is House Planning Help episode 118. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Alongside this, I'm still hoping to create an energy efficient home, ideally before I was 40, which is this coming August, yes. In this session, my guest is Adrian Dobson from RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, and we're going to be looking at how you find the right architect for your project. Before then, a little story, because you know that I'm still looking for plots and checking out some properties that could be demolished and then rebuilt. And this one, to be honest, that we looked at this week was one of those. It's going to happen whether we do it or not. So I thought I'd run through some of the pros and cons as we looked at this. We were getting very, very excited. It was a great location. This is the first one in my hometown that we've checked out because the others that we put bids on have actually been further away in the villages, so would involve a lot of driving backwards and forwards. It's just inevitable. This, however, had a really good walking distance to the schools that perhaps my son, or if we had bigger family, might walk to, some of the best ones in town, so getting excited there. Also nice views out at the back. There would be the fact that it's going to be developed one way or the other, so hopefully if it's knocked down and demolished, someone else would just be doing it anyway. And I could envisage myself living there, just looking at it on paper. The downside was, and I wasn't sure about this, the orientation of the house. You always like it to be south-facing. This one definitely wasn't. In fact, it was east-west, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant, so I got in touch with Elron, my friend, who has a great blog. I'm so pleased with what he's done, elronbarel.com, all about passive house and doing really, really well. And he was just telling me, well, what you ought to do is just make sure passive house is attainable, get someone to do some modelling, either a passive house designer or an architect with those skills. And it might be a good point if you know who you're going to work with in terms of an architect to get them involved in shaping the brief, if you then say about the room uses and areas and requirements and so forth. So that was really interesting, just understanding that if I was going to buy this property, if I want it to be a passive house, that a feasibility was really important before I throw the money in, which I suppose is a little bit obvious. What were some of the other drawbacks? Again, on the upper end of our price spectrum, there's bound to be a lot of interest for this as well. In fact, when we contacted the agent who was dealing with this one, they said it had been up for one night and it had something like 7 or 8 people who'd booked on to take a look at the property on the open day. We thought we'd go down there and take a look at it. And this was what's really interesting. When something looks so good on paper, as I say, we were getting really, really excited. I was telling my dad, yeah, this is the one. This is going to be it. I can see myself living here for a while. Then we actually visited it, and it was quite a different experience. Oh, from the picture, you can't see that. And also there was a lot of traffic. I was actually surprised because I know that I live in a very quiet part of town, and I thought this was too wrong. This was a weekend as well. You wouldn't expect anyone early on a weekend to be shooting around, but they were. So there were just a few factors and it just didn't feel right. It's upsetting when you go through this time and time again. We'll get there eventually. I just thought I'd share that with you because if you're looking for land, I bet you have these stories happening to you all the time. Right, let's get to our interview then. I'm trying to do a few more podcasts on specific professionals, people that you're going to need on your project. And today we're focusing on architects. And where better to go for some help and advice than the Royal Institute of British Architects. Adrian Dobson is my guest, and he's going to give us some tips on finding a good architect, someone that's going to be a good fit as well, right for us. I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about his background.
My name's Adrian Dobson. I'm the Executive Director Members at the Royal Institute of British Architects. I am an architect by training and background, so I have been a practising architect. I worked mainly in the education and social services sector, so really on public buildings, although I have had some experience of residential development. And then about 10 years ago, I went over to the other side and became a part of the administration at the RIBA, so I now work supporting architects.
It's all going to be about architects today. So let's start on a really basic question here. What is an architect?
Well, I suppose in a sense, an architect is somebody who can help a client navigate the complex issue of designing and constructing a building that meets their needs. So really, an architect is a trusted advisor and a facilitator. And obviously, the core skill they bring is that of design. That's at the heart of the architectural process. But they offer much more than that. They help you to navigate the whole complexity of the build process.
And how are they trained? Are all architects trained in the same way?
Yes, I mean, the curriculum for architectural education is set out by the RIBA and the Architects Registration Board. It's a very, very rigorous training. Typically takes at least 7 years from beginning to end, so it's a fairly rigorous process. Usually done the first part in a university environment, although increasingly, like lots of professions, we're looking at, if you like, earn and learn opportunities. So in a sense, there are kind of on-the-job ways in which you can train to be an architect, but predominantly through an academic training followed by supervised professional experience. And after 7 years, you can actually take the AFIX RIBA and practice as an architect. And architects are slightly unusual in that the use of the title architect is protected by statute. So only somebody who's on the architect's register can actually use the title architect. So it isn't that only architects can provide the range of services around building design that you need to develop a property, but only architects can actually use that title of architect. So in a sense, you do know what you're getting. If the name is on the tin, you're getting a qualified architect.
And you mentioned qualifications. Does that mean that there's one type of qualifications, or are you now going to tell me that there are many?
No, I mean, there's basically one standard qualification to become a chartered architect. Clearly, lots of architects, that's not the end of education. I think we're all in a world of lifelong learning. And so, for example, architects have to undertake what we call, the technical term is continuing professional development. But what that's really saying is they have to ensure that they maintain their competence to practice, they keep up with changes in legislation, changes in building design technologies, etc. So architects are continuously training throughout their career. And inevitably, some architects will tend to specialise in some areas more than others. So you may specialise in the healthcare sector, you may specialise by sector, you may specialise by type of service. So, for example, something like conservation work is often seen to be a fairly specialist area of expertise. So if you've got a project that involves a listed building, you probably need to make sure that your architect is somebody who's got, additional knowledge and expertise in that particular area, because you're going to be involved in additional planning consents around listed building status. You're going to be working within parameters about what you can do with a listed building. So that would be an example where you might want somebody with a further specialism.
I'm imagining in the UK, we're quite unusual that I would say, you're probably going to correct me, that most buildings have an architect.
Well, to a degree, I mean, in actual fact, if you talk about planning applications, most planning applications are not architect design. So there's a huge amount of very small alteration, very minor extension work that doesn't have architectural design input. And I guess that's a dilemma in a sense for the domestic clients at the very small end of operation. At what point is it worth bringing in professional expertise? Clearly, my view would be that even in very, very small projects, an architect can often release a lot of value in terms of imaginative use of space, making the best of constrained sites. But there is a level at which you've got to make that judgment, whether you can just go ahead and perhaps obtain planning permission and just appoint a contractor. And even if you've got an architect as a member of your team, do you want that architect to administer the building contract and see it all the way through to completion? Or do you just want the architect to assist you with obtaining planning permission and perhaps building regulations approval, and then just work with a contractor and, if you like, manage the project yourself? I mean, these are some of the questions any domestic client's got to ask themselves at the outset, really.
Looking at an architect versus a designer, what are the benefits then, really? Or could you have a designer of the same merit and skill?
Well, I think it's important to stress that architects don't have a sort of a unique right to design all of the built environment. So, for example, to take an extreme example, like a very high-end design market, there are a number of well-known designers who also operate in the field of built environment and design other objects as well. So you might think of somebody like Thomas Heatherwick, who's clearly a very, very talented designer and has designed buildings. So architects don't have a unique right to be the only designers of the built environment. I think what an architect does offer you, it offers you certain guarantees about the sort of training they've been involved with, that they've got a core design skill, that they understand the legislative framework in which buildings are constructed, etc., that they adhere to a code of conduct. So you can expect standards of professionalism, that by dint of their being on the register and members of the RIBA, that they're going to undertake, as I say, continuing professional development. And you've got a certain guarantee of quality because of the kind of accreditation that bodies like the RIBA offer around practices. So it certainly offers you some reassurance and peace of mind, I would say.
I'm obviously looking to build my own house, but at what stage should I be looking at bringing an architect on board?
Well, again, there's no straightforward answer to that. I would actually say as early as possible. I mean, many clients, particularly professional clients, people who are involved in the development industry, they will have their architect at their side when they're just going to visit a site for the very first time. They want to take advantage of that kind of relationship to help them assess what the development opportunities are. Is it the right kind of site for them? So I would say that architects in many ways, they add their most value at the earliest part of the process, in helping you to appraise a site, make decisions about it, helping you to really understand what your brief is. How can you maximize the value to give you the kind of space, the kind of lifestyle that you're going to aspire to? So I think if you're going to employ an architect, to delay their engagement is actually a false economy. To really get the benefit, you want them on board as early as possible almost in the pre-briefing stage. Helping you to actually define your own brief is a key part of the architect's skill. They should be able to ask you the right questions.
From what you said there, I guess that I could employ an architect at the early stages, even when I'm looking at land. Or can this be done on an hourly basis, or is this the beginning of a bigger contract?
Well, there's no fixed basis for setting an architect's fee. There's a free market in architectural services. Usually it will be a fixed fee divided over what we would call the RIBA plan of work stages. So an RIBA architect will work to the RIBA plan of work. It's simply a number of stages that splits the design, development, construction process up 0 to 7, starting with the brief, moving through concept design, develop design, technical design, onto construction. In the very, very early stages, it possibly might be that you might have an arrangement where you would pay an hourly rate for that early advice, but you would probably then switch to a more fixed fee basis once you get into the actual design. So you might have an hourly rate for site appraisal, feasibility study, brief writing, but then move to a more fixed sum arrangement after that.
What does this mean when comparing architects then?
Well, clearly, when selecting an architect, the fee is going to come into it. So you're going to want to know what are the fees, and that's going to be one of the variables you're going to consider. I think there are a whole series of other things you need to think about as well. I mean, you need to think about the reputation of the practice. Can you look at other projects they've previously constructed? Can you talk to previous clients? What's their area of expertise? Do you have a particular feeling about the type of design you want? If you want a very, very traditional building, not much point in working with an architect whose forte is really highly modern design. Equally, if you've got an ambition to have a highly glazed building and you need somebody who can understand how they can deliver that within the parameters of energy conservation, etc., you probably want somebody who's got that kind of design approach. So thinking about the design approach is also going to be very important. I think the other thing I would say is that as a provider of a service, your relationship with an architect is quite a long-term relationship. It's going to take several months, maybe even years to get a major self-build project from inception to completion. So I think it's important to satisfy yourself that the architect you choose is somebody you can get along with over a long period of time, that you can develop a relationship of trust, and that you will be able to maintain that relationship through what is quite an extended partnership, actually. So that kind of personal and cultural fit, I think, is also quite important. And clearly, you're going to want to meet with at least 3 or possibly even 4 practices and ask them about their fees, understand what their business approach is before you make that choice. You certainly want to look in the marketplace, in a sense.
We'll talk through what might happen in an interview and how we would do that in a moment. But I just wanted to pause on that for a second. And we're very much about energy efficient homes, passive house homes. Does that become easier to select the architect then, or is there a different approach we should be making?
Well, all architects obviously need to be able to comply with current building regulations. So in terms of energy efficiency, the building regulations lay down base standard, if you like. But as you say, Ben, many clients now have aspirations around sustainability and energy efficiency that go far beyond just complying with what the law says they have to provide. It's a conscious choice to want to have a sustainable building. You've already mentioned one of the major standards that's increasingly popular is the passive house standard. I think it's particularly popular because it's really very focused on energy, and it's about trying to predict the energy usage, and you can measure very accurately at the end of the project whether you've achieved your objectives. So it's a very testable standard, if you like. So it's become very, very popular. If you're going to work with passive house standards, your architect needs to be trained in the use of that standard and able to design in that way. But many architects are now taking that accreditation. It's a very, very popular and successful model, the Passive House Standard.
Has that affected anything in the course of becoming an architect, or is this early days really?
No, I mean, I think in fairness to the architectural profession, its engagement with the whole sustainability agenda has been at the leading edge of the construction industry. I mean, I wouldn't like to claim that architects are the lead innovators in the construction industry in every aspect, but certainly in terms of sustainable design, the profession has actually had a reputation for trying to support and encourage its clients to push at the envelope and not just be bound by, legislation. So I think it's something that most architects are very, very comfortable with, and probably part of their job they particularly enjoy. I think architects do want to create sustainable buildings in every sense.
Just a design question that's popped into my head here for a moment, because I always feel that passive houses tend to have almost a look and feel, which is no bad thing, because you could say different eras, Victorian, whatever, they all have a certain feel. I'm going to be interested going through my own build, because my wife is always saying that she doesn't like boxy approaches and all of this thing. So do you think this will develop more as people understand, yes, they could perform to passive house standard, but can do a little bit more? Or are we heading for a future of, perhaps just getting used to more simple shapes, simple form factors?
No, I don't think that the Passive House Standard is as restrictive as that in reality. I think it's like any of these standards that develop. People take time to understand where are the elements of flexibility, how can you actually work with the standard in a more imaginative way. I mean, one of the interesting things to me about Passive House, a little bit off our topic for this morning, but is that originally it was seen really something for the residential market. It was about home design. You're seeing quite a lot of buildings being developed now, much larger buildings, public buildings, commercial buildings that are beginning to utilise the Passive House Standard, and they clearly do not look alike at all. They look very varied, and they're still all operating to the same standard. I think you're right. I think in the early days there was a sense that I think possibly because it was a German standard originally, and it came across with probably some standard design templates.
But also things like windows that in the older buildings they might have more crossbars on the windows. I can't think what the name of those things are. Mullions. That's it. Mullions. But passive house windows are more. Why not just use the glazing? We don't need to have all these mullions.
Well, the standard itself wouldn't affect something like that at all. So that's purely, if you like, a design.
But that's what I'm saying, that we're transitioning to that. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
No, I mean, I think in the debate between sort of, if you like, traditional and more modern design, I think what you are finding is even with very modern design approaches, even if an architect that operates in a very modernist idiom, we're seeing actually a return to some, I suppose what I would say, some vernacular-driven thinking. I don't mean stylistically vernacular, but a sense that using local materials is more sustainable, a sense that traditional approaches to the distribution of glazing around buildings were actually related to climate. Roof forms were related to climate. There's a much more sense that buildings are being designed for locality and climate than perhaps they were even 10, 20 years ago. And I think that's one of the things that actually is very much driving the strong desire for self-build. I think people, I want to be careful what I say to some degree, because I think there's a huge range of volume house builders out there, and they produce huge range of products of different qualities and different types. But I think the problem with the volume house building industry is it does tend to roll out a standardized product in every location. There might be a nod to locality, but it's really a standardized product. And I think the beauty of the self-build industry is it tends to focus on locality and being place specific, and response to climate is part of that.
That's another rabbit hole we always enjoy jumping down there. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you go down there. So interviewing architects then, on that preliminary search, how do we narrow it down to who we want to interview?
Well, I would say, obviously, working for the RIBA, I would say, please do contact the RIBA. We have a service called Find an Architect, which is a very valuable service, I think, enables you to, look at a whole range of architectural practices. Perhaps it's going to be, you probably want to have somebody who's got a reasonably close location. If it's going to be a domestic project, we can narrow it down for you. We can use all sorts of parameters to help you refine your selection. You can see examples of architects' work, etc. I would say, though, that once you get to a short list, it's really important to meet the architect, I would say, if at all possible, visit some of the buildings that they've actually delivered, get a sense for what is the product they can produce. And I think it is about those two things, really. It's about product and process, satisfy yourself that this particular architect can produce a product of the type that you want, not necessarily in an identical solution that they've given for somebody else, but that's going to be compatible with your desires, and satisfy yourself that this is somebody who understands the process. I think an important thing to ask yourself is, can they explain the process to you in terms that you can understand? Can they actually explain to you what's involved in assessing a site, developing a brief, going through the design process, what's required to get planning permission, what information is needed for building regulations? Can they give you a simple and understandable strategy for how you might then select a builder to actually construct the project? Can they explain the process to you? And do you feel confident that you could work with them over, as I say, this quite extended period? Are you happy that they can take you through that process and that you can work well together?
One tip that I've heard recently that I thought was quite good about selecting a builder was to find one who is genuinely interested in looking back at their past projects and thinking, how can I make this better? So does the same apply with an architect, and how could we phrase that in a question?
I think it does. And I think, hand on heart, not just architects, but the whole construction industry has traditionally been very weak in this area. You will hear a lot about the so-called performance gap in the industry. Does it deliver what it really promises? Whether that's about the energy consumption of buildings, the build quality, etc. We haven't really had a strong, if you like, consumer focus as an industry. I think that's a fair criticism. And we should have, because, for example, for architects, something like 45% of their future clients are actually repeat clients, so their past clients, not only should they be interested in how their buildings have performed, because that should inform their next projects, they actually should be interested in how they perform because they're actually very, very important potential future customers for them. They may well commission them again for a further building.
I didn't realise that. It's a good fact.
So it's that's a positive incentive. And I think we have been weak in it. So I think it's a very valid question to ask. Have you been back to some of your projects? What kind of feedback have you got? How has the building actually performed, both in technical terms, and what feedback have you got from previous clients as to whether did it create the right kind of environment and spaces to deliver the kind of lifestyle that they sought? And that's clearly, if you're going to employ an architect, you really want to ensure that you've got a solution that's tailored to your needs. That's the whole point, isn't it, in one sense,
Any other questions that might be useful to ask them?
Well, you definitely want to make sure you understand the scope of services that they're providing. Your architect will need to have a written appointment agreement with you, and this is sometimes quite a difficult thing for people to understand, because I think for somebody commissioning a domestic building, when they first get the kind of architect's appointment document, which in the end is a legal contract, that can be quite off-putting for people. I think it's important to understand that the architect has no choice about that. The regulation says, the Architects Registration Board Code of Conduct, and actually some European directives will say that there must be an appointment agreement in writing. The client must know what you've committed to deliver and what their obligations are in return. Now, as part of that documentation, the important thing to understand is what's the scope of service that they're going to provide. What can you expect that they're going to deliver? So at one level, that could be quite simple. I touched on the point earlier, how far are you going to expect the architect to go with you down the process? Do you want them just to take it as far as planning? Do you want it to include building regulations? Do you want it to include the tender of the building contract? Do you want it to actually include the inspection of works on site and the administration of the contract? So there may be different degrees to which you wish to employ the architect.
And why? Why would we choose to stop at one of these points?
Well,
cost?
Yes, I mean, certainly that might be a factor, because obviously the more services the architect is going to provide, the greater the fee is going to be. The strong argument for involving the architect in the contract administration is it gives you that level of quality control over the build that you're going to have to ensure yourself if you don't employ the architect. But, I think we also have to be clear that the economics of self-build mean that in some circumstances, clients will choose to manage, to do that project management element themselves. The architect clearly has got experience. An architect is used to administering a contract to try and ensure that things happen on time, the building is completed on cost and to the right quality. That's really what contract administration is all about. Can you meet the time, cost, quality requirements? But at the same time, an experienced contractor on a small project, you may feel confident that you can get that delivery anyway. So that's going to be one factor. The other thing is also to understand, though, within the scope of service, exactly what's going to be delivered at those stages. What can be your realistic expectation expectation. It could be something simple. If it's about feasibility study, are you going to be shown a number of options? Is it going to be 2 or 3 options? Is it going to be 5 or 6 options? It's that kind of level of detail I think it's useful to ask about. And then you're not going to have any false expectation on either side. The architect knows what they've got to deliver, and you reasonably know what you can expect to receive.
Is there more of an argument as someone coming to this first time to build a house to employ more of the services of the architect? Or again, is this a hazy area because the contractor might cover that knowledge gap as well?
Yeah, I don't think there can be any hard and fast answer. I mean, as a representative of architects, I would obviously want to say, the architect is going to add value at every point of the process, and the safest bet is to have the architect engaged all the way through. I think it's probably not the case that it's absolutely clear cut in every instance like that. It's partly also just a personal preference of how actively engaged you as the client want to be in the design and build process. Some people, they really do just want to have a guarantee of a product, and they're happy to entrust that to somebody to help them to get there. Some people are very motivated to be very active and very hands-on and engaged in the process. And so partly I think it probably comes down to personal preference as well, and what level of engagement you want in the process.
We've obviously got limited time, but have we covered most of the bases about how you might select a good architect for this sort of project?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think it clearly think about what range of services you want and make sure that the architect has had experience in delivery of those kind of services. Think about what kind of building or home you design. Make sure the architect has a working style and a design style that is compatible with that. I think there's no point in trying to work with somebody where it's chalk and cheese. You've got to make sure there's a kind of empathy between the two. It is a partnership at the end of the day.
Well, perhaps we could finish up on this question then. Working with the architect, how do we make sure that we keep this relationship going as well as we possibly can?
I think that the most important thing is that there's clear communication and honest communication. So I do quite a lot of lecturing in schools of architecture to trainee architects, and I do quite a lot of seminars for architects in practice, and talk about it would be false to say that projects never go wrong. There are problems on projects, and architects can sometimes pick up the telephone to the RIBA when they've got themselves in difficulty. I would say most issues where things have gone badly wrong are when there's been poor communication and a difficulty in being honest. So I always say to architects, if anything occurs during any part of the project that's going to affect the brief, what's going to actually be delivered in terms of the spaces and accommodation, going to affect the cost, going to affect the time scale, going to affect the quality, regardless of whether that's something that's in the control of the architect or way beyond the control of the architect, you need to tell your client as soon as possible. You need to be very upfront and say, look, there's an issue here. Don't ever, allow things to roll on. They need to know about anything that's going to affect any of those parameters, because in the end, they're the person that's going to be most affected by it. So that's on the part of the architect. Transparency, honesty, clear information about anything that's going to affect the outcome. I think from the point of view of the client, being willing to be decisive when necessary, make decisions as required. The great beauty of the UK construction industry is it's very flexible. You can change your mind about almost anything at any point. You can change things around, but it will cost you money. You need to make the right decisions early on, and once you've made a decision, probably best to stick to it. So at the stage of concept design, there's incredible flexibility, and the cost to change is very, very low. It's another hour of the architect's time. Once you've started to construct on site, cost to change, opportunity to change is still there, but cost is enormous. So I would say being decisive at the right times and trying to make the right decisions early on is really key. I think that will really help the relationship.
Well, 100 odd podcasts in, and I've only just made it to RIBA, but I'm very pleased to have this chat. Adrian, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Ben. Come back again soon, as well.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session at houseplanninghelp.com/118. You can review the key points. There are some photos on there as well. And if you have a comment that you'd like to leave or a question you'd like to ask, do that at the bottom of the show notes as ever. We'll link up to Adrian on Twitter and also to the main RIBA website. All of that information at houseplanninghelp.com/118. Quick announcement for you, and then we'll do a hub update. We're holding a meetup at EcoBuild, which is approaching any second now. So if you're at EcoBuild on the first day this year, please come along. It'd be lovely to meet you, find out what you're up to and your self-build and the progress that you're making. So houseplanninghelp.com/events will take you to the Eventbrite page so that you can sign up and get all the information of where you need to meet us. It's totally free as well. So I would love to see you there if you can do that. Also, that domain name there, the /events, will always have the latest events if we're organising something else. So even if that's not the case at the moment, that this has gone into the past, then you can go and check out another event that might be lined up and in the future. Our hub update, this is all live, the latest module. It's now addressing insulation and air tightness. And what we've done is we've focused this on Passive House. This was a question that came from Donald inside the hub, and he was asking about some best practice. So we decided, because we haven't really covered Passive House, instead of just jumping straight to best practice, we got the basics of that, and then we build in some things to look out for, some checklists, all of those sorts of things towards the end of that module. We've also got another video from the Long Barrow self-build project. We're up to the stage now where they're building the basement in insulated concrete formwork. So you can see, if you've never seen that happen before, this is Charcon, the product that they're using, how it all goes together and how you get that great air tightness and insulation. If you've wondered how ICF works, this is a good way to see. And then there's the Facebook group, which is our networking. I'm really pleased with how this is going. So far, everyone that has signed up to the hub have been exactly the sort of people that I wanted. Thank you so much for that. You're all actually doing projects or trying to get there, which is the only thing I could ask for, really. If you want to sign up, our price is low at the moment. Get ready. We are soon ramping up the price, but it's £45 for the year. So it's a no-brainer at this point. Just head to houseplanninghelp.com/hub for more information. Next time, Harvey Fremlin from the Self-Build and Renovation Centre is my guest. We're going to be looking at sourcing materials. Thank you so much for listening again. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.